Visual analysis of photography and film. My name is Oksana Sarkisova. I'm a researcher at Lincoln Open Society Archives and head of the Visual Studies platform and also one of the instructors for that course that we are doing together with several colleagues. Some of them we are lucky to have here, with Renata, head of the Legal Studies Department and head of the Constitutional Law program. And there are also two CEU colleagues, Jeremy Braverman, whom many of you know. He is media and visual education specialist here at CEU, a filmmaker running a lot of practice filmmaking courses, and also Jesse Labov from Center for Media, Data and Society. And for this course, we are very fortunate to have several guest speakers joining us with a public lecture and also with a follow-up seminar, which will take place tomorrow in the morning for those who are taking the course. So I'm happy to welcome the students from the course, but also broader CEU and beyond CEU community. We're very happy that we have a mixed group here. I would like to say thank you to Tunde Sabo and Sylvie Neyman for all the logistical arrangements for this talk and for tomorrow's seminar, and also to Johnny Hunter for recording this talk to make sure that the trace will be lasting. This talk is organized by the Visual Studies platform, which is a cross-university initiative to bring the visual material to the attention of different students from various disciplines, and the interdisciplinarity is at the core of this initiative and of the course itself. The course seeks to provide introduction into the methods of using visual material for a variety of research in humanities and social sciences, and it's driven by a set of questions that relate to the construction of objectivity, the representation of the other, the social context that condition our understanding of images, how images are appropriated and how their meaning is redefined. All of these themes are part of the 12-week course, and they will be at the core of our discussion today as well. I'm very happy to have Professor Christopher Pinney with us, who is Professor of Anthropology and Visual Culture at University College London, and who is working on primarily on commercial print culture and photography in South Asia and also with popular Hinduism in central India. He is the author of multiple works, several monographs, Camera Indica, The Social Life of Indian Photographs, published in 1997, Photos of the Gods, The Printed Image and Political Struggle in India, that came out in 2004, and recently Photography and Anthropology in 2011, that we will also engage with in more detail tomorrow. He's also editor and co-editor of several volumes, Photography's Other Histories and Beyond Aesthetics, Art and the Technology of Enchantment. He's currently leading the European Research Council project Photo Demos, Citizens of Photography. And I would like to finish this introduction or open the talk with a quotation from Christopher Pinney's starting sentences from Photos of the Gods, where he is writing, "Can one have a history of images that treats pictures as more than simply a reflection of something else, something more important happening elsewhere? Is it possible to investigate history as in part determined by struggles occurring at the level of the visual?" These two questions can really be taken as a motto questions or central questions for the Visual Studies platform and a lot of the initiatives that we are doing here. And they will also lead us, I believe, through the talk of tonight, which is titled The Waterless Sea, A Cultural and Political History of Mirages, which investigates this very complex phenomenon, discusses the philosophical importance of images that are real but not true. We here at CEU in this moment of time and space know very well what it is to live with the images that are real but not true, but we would like to put it into the broader spatial and historical context as well, and I would like to ask you to join me in welcoming Christopher Pinney, and the word is yours, the floor is yours. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Oksana, for a very generous introduction. I'm very pleased to be here. I'm also especially pleased to be in the Ernest Gellner room. He was a rather intimidating, charismatic figure in the first few years of my postdoc career in Cambridge, and someone I came to have a rather conflictual relationship with, but as the decades have washed away, I now feel nothing but reverence and kindly vibrations towards the great man. Okay, I have a text that I'm going to read, and it's going to last 1 hour, and I do hope this formality doesn't breach any local social convention, but here we go. In the 1870s, the naturalist Alfred Russel Wallace wrote to the prestigious science journal Nature, inquiring whether any readers had encountered a, quote, good and honestly constructed cyclopedia, by which he meant one that does not send you hunting for information from one volume to another and refer you backwards and forwards to articles that do not exist. Wallace then highlighted what he described as a particularly outrageous example of this will-o'-the-wisp, the elusive phenomenon of mirage. He describes his hunt for reliable information on unusual atmospheric refraction. The entry on refraction directed him to mirage and fata morgana, which in turn directed him to refraction, atmospheric, extraordinary. Returning to the letter R, he found the article reflection and refraction, but was here referred to light optics, refraction, refrangibility. Then the letter A, atmosphere, atmospheric, nothing on the subject. Letter E, extraordinary refraction, nothing but a reference again to mirage. Wallace's misleading cyclopedias deserve to be as celebrated as Borges' Chinese encyclopedia, both of them with their arbitrary taxonomy. Wallace's whimsical cyclopedia is most like a catoptric fistula. Oh, I want to do it here, don't I? So I've fallen at the first, start it again. Sorry, I'm a Mac person and the layout is different here. I want to get it on full screen. Yeah, could you just get it on full screen and presumably I toggle it there, yeah? Okay. Ah, okay, great, thank you. So Wallace's whimsical cyclopedia is most like a catoptric fistula or theatre, a device for the endless magnification of objects, except that in Wallace's case, it is an empty fistula. It is also, of course, a witty allegory of the nature of mirages, anomalous, shape-shifting phenomenon, forever mobile and mutable, and which long escaped what Borges termed the rigour of science. My task in this talk is to populate the catoptric box, to provide locations and points of reference for the will-o'-the-wisp that so frustrated Wallace, without falling for the eccentric typology or over-ambitious cartography that preoccupied Borges. This account attempts to navigate a pathway through a mysterious and evanescent terrain, showing how mirages were yoked to other concerns, how they came to have a politics, and how we can continue to learn from their sublimity. It attempts to insert mirages in a world history, connecting them in patterns that exceed the narrow national concerns of nature writing or travel writing, revealing the ways in which mirages became prisms through which religions and systems of rule were imagined and the very limits of vision confronted. I first became aware of mirages through a dangerous thing called Mirage. I was sitting in the front room of a Jain friend's village home in Malwa, central India. He runs a small shop supplying villagers with daily necessities such as matches, mouth freshener and light bulbs. Customers would frequently call, often to buy small packets of chewing tobacco called Mirage. their brilliant yellow packets defaced with lurid images of cancerous mouths as required by Government of India health guidelines. This dual nature of Mirage as both poison and cure can serve as a leitmotif for the mirages I will consider here. These too will be incarnated as objects of enchantment, like Mirage's shiny yellow packaging, and also as vengeance, like the ulcerous palates which blighted those yellow packets. The next section is called Strange Visions Under a Cliff in Central India, October 1829. Fortuitously, one of the most enchanting accounts of mirages was published 180 years earlier, very near to where I contemplated the poison and cure of Mirage tobacco. Major James Abbott was traversing the plains of central India in October 1829 en route the town of Mo in Malwa when he first encountered a mirage of distant cliffs, usually seen shortly after sunrise. These cliffs were so substantial in appearance, so marked with rent and fissures, so tufted with bushes, shrubs and lichens, so clear and distinct of outline, that it seemed scarcely possible for an unpracticed eye to doubt their reality. He promised himself several times that, quote, in the afternoon he would pay those vast cliffs a visit, but by then they had always disappeared, leading him to question whether he had not been suffering some illusion of the eye or mind. These illusions, which were fancifully lithographed for an 1854 report in the Journal of the Asiatic Society of Bengal, were most definitely pleasurable. Cliffs which laboured under a monotonous aspect were diversified by and enlivened by the presence of a town or of moving objects, and clothed with the richest verdure stolen from green cornfields, drawn up aloft as by enchantment to garnish the fairy structure. Villages buried beneath the convexity of the earth's surface are seen hanging reversed in the air, and should any small river with its boats be flowing there, all the shifting scenery will be presented in the clouds, the white sails greatly magnified and distorted, having a truly spectral appearance as they hover silently by. Abbott then reproduces as a plate a beguiling and beautiful image of, quote, a lake city as it might appear in Mirage, a panoramic image of the fantastical Oriental metropolis of minarets and domes suspended at the far right of a serene expanse of water, far edge of a serene expanse of water, in the foreground of which stand Gothic ruins. One can't help seeing in this image Abbott's imagination of the Rajasthani city of Udaipur, recently elevated to similar magical effect through the romantic workings of Colonel James Todd in his Annals and Antiquities of Rajasthan, the first volume of which was published in 1829, the very year in which Abbott locates his earlier experiences. Indeed, Todd himself had written at length about mirages in an equally enthusiastic tone. Todd notes that on a cold winter's morning en route Ajmer, he witnessed a, quote, magnificent mirage, and then proceeds to provide invaluable evidence of local terms for the phenomenon. The Maru terming it Sikote, literally the cold weather castles, which he glosses as castles in the air. Conversely, in the deep desert to the westward, the herdsmen and travellers style it Chitram, the picture, while about the plains of the Chambal and Jamuna, they term it Desasur, the omen of the quarter. This optical deception has been noticed from the remotest times, he says. Todd then suggests that Chitram are inferior mirages, whereas Sikote are superior Fata Morgana, where the traveller might imagine that they would find a night's lodging, but would not expect to slake his thirst there. There's a subtle allusion there to the difference between inferior and superior mirages, which we could unpack in the discussion at this time. An early account of Fata Morgana, a complex form of superior mirage with elaborate horizontal and vertical features in Scientific American, drew on the work of the Jesuit physicist Joseph Maria Puente in a very clear explanation of its optics. The beholder views the world through air whose density, especially in temperate regions, is continually changing. Puente suggested that this was similar to the effect of viewing the world through inferior window glass full of bubbles. This is a 19th century Pontil, which I hope illustrates what Puente was pointing to. As the viewer moves the glass from side to side, the world is seen through different thicknesses of glass, and objects appear and disappear. If the glass is of poor quality, there will also be a multiplication of images, as in the case with Fata Morgana. Fata Morgana's ground zero is the Straits of Messina, the water that separates the eastern tip of Sicily from Calabria. Home to whirlpools thought to be the origin of the Scylla and Charybdis myth, the straits have long been the site for the appearance of a complex superior mirage, often with elaborate architectural features. Although known to the ancients, the earliest documented account is given by Fazello in 1558, but the classic early description of this, dating from 1773, which we see here, is by the Dominican friar Antonio Minassi, and would be anthologized in numerous later accounts. It describes various multiplied objects, such as numberless series of pilasters, arches, and castles. This astonishing vision appears in the water as a marine mirage, and it is this which the most famous early depiction records. This Fata Morgana also manifested as an aerial, actually superior mirage, producing effects similar to that shown in a wonderfully imagined chromolithograph in the 1913 German compendium Die Wunder der Natur, in which we see a Sicilian sailor gazing at a magical towering apparition, a fluttering airborne concatenation whose original elements are all clearly discernible in the shoreline below. Minassi likened the image to a catoptric theatre, that device popularised by Athanasius Kircher, and which had involved a folding box lined with mirrors in such a way that they replicated reflections to infinity. Significantly, Kircher had himself travelled to Reggio in the to-be-thwarted hope of seeing the Mirage, and would publish one of the earliest accounts of the Fata Morgana in 1646. Kircher was of the belief that the spectacle was created by tiny airborne crystalline fragments of rock and sand, so much so that he collected samples to take to Rome, where he heated them in a vessel made into the shape of the Straits of Messina, before passing a light through the haze in a surprisingly, I think amazingly and impossibly, successful effort to generate a mirage. This endeavour he later repeated in front of sundry ecclesiastics, with the addition of projected moving warriors and devils upon a screen. So he folded it into his eschatology. The next section is called A World History of Mirages, The Thirst of the Gazelle. This journey from 19th century colonial India to medieval Sicilian reworkings of Arthurian legend may well be worthy of inclusion in Wallace's misleading cyclopedia. Mirages truly occupy a catoptric box, in which every account and experience of one finds its mirror echo in some other place or time. Like Wallace's cyclopedia, one entry seems always to refer to another, which in turn leads to another. These early musings are often driven by a feeling of wonder and a sense of crisis about the forms of knowledge that depend upon visual certainty. Sometimes, as in India or China and Japan, the intent is to place the mirage within a deep civilizational tradition and to demonstrate how myth and poetry has responded to the ephemeral and mysterious. We might think of these as strategies of enchantment. Elsewhere, most notably in the deserts, what Kipling memorably condemned as the sand-bordered hell of West Asia and North Africa, mirages signify something more ambivalent. Islamic West Asia and North Africa emerge as the natural home of mirages, as much because of European anxieties about Islam as because of the particular heat gradients to be found in desert environments. So I'm introducing the political narrative here. Why do core visualizations of mirages assume certain locations rather than others? Here, mirages seem to mediate fundamental contests of vision and questions of transparency and occlusion that European travellers systematically saw as heightened by Islam. This is further complicated by a long European preoccupation with Ottoman dreaming and an even longer Islamic tradition that opposes the truth of dreams to the falsity of everyday sense perception. In the cultural contact zones where mirages appeared, there were frequently more than one narrative about the significance and nature of mirage. Often local narratives are folded into the scientific repertoire. We can recover an Indian vision of the phenomenon via another more global text with which Abbott might well have also been familiar. This is Humboldt's 1834 Views of Nature, whose supplementary commentary noted the Sanskrit concept of the thirst of the gazelle, before also mentioning the French expedition to Egypt, where, quote, this optical illusion often nearly drove the faint and parched soldiers to distraction, and to which we owe the introduction of the term mirage, and of Diodorus Siculus' description of the strange elusive appearance of an African Fata Morgana. The image of deer or gazelle searching for illusory water illustrates the Sanskritic concept of Mrig Trishna, a concept recognized today in the village where those Mirage tobacco packets are sold. In that village, Mrig Trishna is thought to be an oasis in Rajasthan. However, as a mid-20th century illustration from the pious journal Kalyan clearly demonstrates, the thirst of gazelles is a metaphor for human longing for what can never be found. In the Kalyan image, the deer meet their end in the sand dunes under a blazing sun above an analogical register of human desire. Three kinds of mohit denoting allure. In the middle section of the image, by Gita Press's resident artist B.K. Mitra, we see an adulterous couple whose passions need to be cooled by an electric fan. Under the heading Kam Mohit, the allure of lust, and a greedy pipe-smoking merchant surrounded by sacks of cash under the sign of Lobh Mohit, the allure of avarice, and two men smoking and drinking behind closed curtains secretly under the sign of Mad Mohit, the allure of intoxication. In India, the connection between deer, desire, and illusion is deep. Valmiki's Ramayana pivots one of its most dramatic episodes around the disguise of the Rakshas or demon Marika, whose name conveys the sense of mirage, in the form of the beautiful deer for whose skin the exiled Sita yearns. Next section is called Mocking Our Distress. The scientific response, in which mirages were conjured only so that they could be dissolved by reason, was on occasion overly optimistic. The power of mirage lay in its extraordinary presence and its insistence on its own account of reality. Time and again, the beholder of the mirage describes how they know what they behold is an optical effect and not a true version of the world, and how the visual data continually threatens this scepticism. The Irish abolitionist R.R. Madden, encountering a mirage 10 miles from Suez in the 1820s, addressed this conundrum very directly. Quote, if I were to speak of the nature of mirage from my own sensations, I should say it was more of a mental hallucination rather than a deception of the sight. For although I was aware of the existence of the mirage, I could not prevail on myself to believe that the images which were painted on my retina were only reflected, like those in dream, from the imagination, and yet it was so. This quality of the mirage prefigures questions which emerged later in the 19th century about magic and cinema. Many concerned with magic stage performances debated, as Murray Leader puts it, the extent to which the audience should be allowed complicity with the workings of the trick. Similarly, in film, the question focused on whether the audience should be let into the secret. Quote, should the projector be out of the audience's view, deepening cinema's illusionism, or should it be on display, making the technology itself central to the show? Murray Leader, developing Simon During's observation that modern culture, like secular magic, is built upon illusions understood as illusions, draws the important conclusion that magic creates a halfway knowing spectator, a spectator who is allowed a certain kind of complicity in the magician's technique. This perfectly describes the ambivalent position of the Mirage spectator, who, as so many accounts reiterate, finds themselves seduced by what they know to be real but not true. They share a complicity in the mechanics of Mirage. They understand that it is the result of refraction contingent on the differential density of air, but the act of beholding involves an erasure of this distantiating knowledge. They can rationalize the optics of Mirage, but to the extent that they are seduced by its wonder, they succumb to magic. Next section is called Hot and Cold. Mirages have been observed in any environment where there are sufficient temperature gradients or temperature inversions to generate the necessary refraction. There are enough descriptions of Arctic Fata Morgana to fill a whole book whose subject might be complex cold weather superior mirages. In fact, I've just written a chapter for a book on the culture of the sea that kind of does that looks, for instance, at Ross and Parry's 1818 attempt to chart the Northwest Passage, which was defeated by the blockage of Croker's Mountains, which subsequent investigation revealed to have been an enormous mirage. And John Ross, the commander, made the fatal error of naming this mirage after the Chief Secretary of the Admiralty, thus more or less ending his subsequent career. It appears in all in the official account of this voyage. And then we have figures like Scoresby. So there's also a very interesting narrative about how practical knowledge, mariners' knowledge, seamen's knowledge engages with these very confusing phenomena. So William Scoresby, who is a whale fisherman, publishes two accounts, first in 1818, that are then hailed by empirical scientists as providing new and reliable evidence on the nature of this mysterious phenomenon, and that works through to the 1888 SS Germania expedition as well. If we had time, we could also include the fascinating case of St. Brandon or St. Borondon, an island which from about 1560 was thought to be part of the Canary complex. This comes from Martin, this is Larousse Encyclopedia's simplified version of Martin Behaim's Erd Apfel from 1492, which is in the Nuremberg Museum. And you see the size of this island, which subsequently turned out to be a mirage effect, but appeared on hundreds of maps over more than 2 centuries. So there are plenty. I'm about to talk about hot mirages and explore in more detail the connection, the pejorative connection with Islam in European political theory. But I want to make the point that there are plenty of non-hot climate mirages happening, but they don't get the same kinds of cultural narratives attached to them for various reasons, some obvious and some not so obvious. Hot mirages generally invoke spaces marked by extremity or threat. Sometimes rising temperatures encourage a memorable poetry of deliquescence. An anonymous correspondent in Chambers' Edinburgh Journal in 1836 described a mirage in Madras in which, quote, the whole landscape appeared to have given way like molten silver. The buildings in the distance looked as if their foundations had been removed, while the shattered and broken walls danced to and fro as if under the influence of some magical principles of attraction and repulsion. Whilst many patches of imaginary water, the celebrated mirage of the desert, floating where no water could have existed, mocked our sight in this fantastic landscape. Mirages in hot environments were ultimately cruelly dishonest, but while the delusion lasted, were able to deliver cooling relief. Even more lyrical was W.H. Bartlett's 1848 evocation of the landscape between Cairo and Petra. Quote, half dozing, half dreaming, he's lulled into a reverie. The startling mirage, shifting with magic play, expands in gleaming blue lakes whose cool borders are adorned with waving groves, and on whose shining banks the mimic waves with wonderful illusion break in long, glittering lines of transparent water. Bright, fresh water, so different from the leathery decoction of the zemzemia. This last word, zemzemia, refers to a leather water bottle which takes its name from the Zemzem, the sacred well at Mecca. And in the contrast between its leathery decoction, a concentrated liquor with fresh, transparent water, Mirage appears as primal, natural and pure, something, although imaginary, that is positively contrasted with Islam. As we shall see later in many other accounts, mirages frequently signify Islam itself. And I think most strikingly in this engraving from Illustrated London News, where there's no story, there's no news to relate. There's simply a metaphor about an allegory about the connection between mirage, heat, desert, death, and Islam. So we start to see the political work that Islam is increasingly called upon to perform. Okay, next section is called Oriental Mirages and Spectatorial Democracy. The history of Oriental Mirages was inaugurated during Napoleon's 1798 to 1801 Egyptian invasion. It's widely believed that we owe the word mirage via the French, and ultimately from the Latin mirari, to wander, itself to this expedition. One of the many experts involved in this grand scheme, the mathematician Gaspard Monge, saw a standard inferior mirage, a body of alluring water that disappeared and retreated before reappearing. He shared in the disappointment of his thirsty colleagues, but went on to publish a paper in the Memoires sur l'Égypte in 1800, this widely being considered the first optical theory of mirages. So Monge is usually credited with using the term first of all, but in fact he himself acknowledges that he encountered it as a mariner's term in an Italian dictionary in 1751, so it clearly has a much longer, earlier mariners, workers vocabulary use. T. Lawrence of Arabia so-called, would produce one of the greatest monuments to mirage's occlusion, an opacity that is also allowed a certain productivity. Lawrence's 7 Pillars of Wisdom presents mirage as an ever-present feature of the desert. Mirage blinds. He writes of those remaining, quote, minutes of the day in which the mirage did not make eyes and glasses useless. When Lawrence arrives in Man on the Hejaz Railway, occlusion is sutured with Ottoman sleepiness. Quote, for concealment we trusted to the mirage and midday drowsiness of the Turks. This connection between mirage and Turkish dreaminess is something we'll encounter again shortly. It alerts us to the manner in which these travel accounts with their fixation with Mirage, contributed to the enduring European imagination of the Orient, as Edward Said would later argue, as a phantasm, quote, a space of occlusion and illusion linked to bad politics. Mirages as anomalous optical phenomena demand contextualization within a political history of light. Within this broad field, the deception of Mirage raises the issue of transparency. Transparency and visibility remain fundamental to European political discourse. World governments are evaluated and ranked by the anti-corruption NGO Transparency International. Their map of perceptions of corruption could almost serve as an illustration of Said's thesis. We might also contemplate Norman Foster's design for the Bundestag dome on top of Berlin's Reichstag, where a canopy of glass and steel monumentalizes the necessity of inspection and clarity. A tiny footnote on this image, which doesn't appear in a book I recently did on Mirages. It was being printed in China, and under their new policy of enforcing the territorial integrity of Taiwan, they noticed that there was a difference in colour coding because Taiwan was deemed to be less corrupt than mainland China. So the printing of this book was halted until the image was removed or replaced. Anyway, I thought it was a personal insight into a geopolitical crisis unfolding. These ideas feel very much part of our current epoch, and yet they have a long and intriguing history. Perhaps the clearest statement of them was delivered between 1835 and 1840 by Alexis de Tocqueville in his work Democracy in America, and has since become known as the spectatorial mode of politics. Democratic citizens, Tocqueville wrote, quote, like to discern the object which engages their attention with extreme clearness, and they therefore strip off as much as possible all that covers it. They rid themselves of whatever conceals it from sight in order to view it more closely and in the broad light of the day. This disposition of mind soon leads them to condemn forms which they regard as useless or inconvenient veils between them and the truth. Tocqueville describes a not yet post-truth society or of spectacularization. The hypothesis I propose here is that mirages assume particular prominence in Orientalist narratives when they are linked to what was seen to be bad politics, and especially to what became known as Oriental or Asiatic despotism. The experience of mirages was not, of course, uniquely an artifact of Orientalist description. They are actual physical phenomena resulting from heat gradients. They are universally optically perceived in ways that are not subject in any profound way to cultural conditioning, and they can be photographed. Although they may well not be true, they are undoubtedly real. Consequently, humans in different parts of the world have marvelled over the millennia at these remarkable visions. It seems that all humans see mirages in similar, not identical, similar ways, while inflected by the interpretive schemata of their local situation. But of course they have produced different theories to explain them. And more importantly, for the specific hypothesis proposed here, there are parts of Asia where mirages have been commonly experienced, but where, because they did not coincide with an anxiety about Oriental despotism, and especially the role of Islam within this, mirages have never been systematically orientalized in the ways that they have been elsewhere. Next section is called From Clam Monsters to Representative Democracy. Mirages have been and are part of Japanese life. One of the most extensive internet resources on the optics of Fata Morgana documents optical phenomena on and around Lake Biwa, just north of Kyoto. It's run by two physics students who live in Kyoto. Furthermore, the mirage is woven into Japanese mythology through the image of the island of Harai, known to the Chinese as Penglai. The zone of transculturation between China and Japan, of which Penglai Horai were one product, and Fusang, the mysterious land lying to the east of China, was another, has been the subject of a wonderfully inspired discussion by Edward H. Schaefer. Fascinated by the, quote, pavilions, eyries and follies that occasionally drift by or materialise before the astonished eyes of early travellers in the open seas, he finds himself searching for clues in 7th to 10th century poetry, especially those poems addressed to Chinese dignitaries heading east. The clam monsters were prodigious mollusks that Chinese and Japanese beliefs saw as the origin of Fata Morganas. The origin of these phantom paradises. The exhalations from these clams sometimes burst the film of surface tension and appeared to astonish mariners as stunning mansions adrift on the surface of the deep. In 1907, Lafcadio Hearn, the Greek-Irish Buddhist convert, lecturer in English literature at the Imperial University of Tokyo from 1896 to 1903, and incomparable fabulist and romancer of all things Japanese, would publish The Romance of the Milky Way. This included a short section concerning the mythology relating to Shinkiro, Mirage, noting that images sometimes showed a toad exhaling a vapour in which was figured the island of Harai, but that even more common were images which, echoing the poetry that Schaefer discusses, depicted a clam or mollusk, a hamaguri, which, quote, sends into the air a purplish misty breath, and that mist takes form and defines in tints of mother of pearl the luminous vision of Horai. This legend is marvellously imagined in Utamaro's teacher Toriyama Seikin's 1781 supernatural bestiary Gazu Hyaki Yagyo. A double-page woodblock print in the first volume of the third book depicts a huge clam exhaling a wonderfully ornate Fata Morgana in which the Dragon King's palace nestles among the mountains of Horai. The same molluscular birth of a mirage is presented in Shunsen's 1830 The Clan's Mirage, or The Dragon's Palace, in which a delighted group on the shoreline point to the miraculous vision. Beachside spectators are also deployed in Utagawa Kunisawa's beautiful coloured woodblock triptych Mirage in the Mist, 1863, in which a female clam seller points to a city of temples visible in a mirage exhaled by a giant clam. In the same artist's later fan print, a courtesan by the shore surprised by the appearance of the mirage, published between 1854 and 60, we see a modern beauty looking to her right at a clam from which a mysterious small cloud is emerging. Here. Both Sekien and Kunisada's images bring with them the odour of sfumato, the wispy vapour of the clams turned into the smoky byproduct of some magical transformation. Schaefer significantly suggests that the derelict word fnast, just in case you're not familiar with it, which the OED defines as breath, especially an exhortation or snort, has two advantages as a descriptor for this clam sfumato. One transcultural and one empirically descriptive. It is not encumbered by assumptions about concepts such as breath and pneuma, and is furthermore, quote, consonant with the bubbly wheezing of giant clams. The connection between clams and mirages can be found in unexpected places. A 1913 postcard, here, shows a superb Shinkiro, that's the caption, Mirage, and is marked on the verso with a souvenir stamp from an aquarium which encloses the outline of the entrance to the aquarium in the shape of a clam. However, European Orientalist enthusiasm for Japan has rarely generated mirage literature, and mirages do not seem to be the source of cultural or political anxiety. So what I'm trying to explain here is why does Islam suffer from all this punitive Mirage ideology, and Japan seems to get a clean ride. A possible explanation for this is that Japan had inaugurated its own version of spectatorial democracy in 1890 with the establishment under the Meiji constitution of the Imperial Diet, and it was this perhaps that consigned the Shinkiro to the past. Meiji was written with two ideographs denoting bright government, not the opacity of archaic sfumato. Bunmai Kaika, civilization and enlightenment, was to be found not only through technological modernity, but also, so the champion of Western values, Fukuzawa Yukichi, argued, a liberal spirit of free inquiry and dispute. The Imperial Diet, despite its limited powers, embodied the importance of representative democracy alongside a constitutional monarchy, a duality evidenced in many woodblock triptychs from the period. There's a sort of subgenre of parliamentarians looking at each other across these triptychs. I mean, they're fantastic, amazing things. The Imperial Diet, despite its limited powers, embodied the importance of representative democracy alongside a constitutional monarchy, a duality evidenced in many woodblock triptychs from the period. All these images share a striking architecture of spectatorship, in which a central figure addresses members of the Diet as if they were the audience in a theatre, speaking through the fourth wall in an unveiled panopticon. Everyone sees everyone else. Next section is called Theatrical Mirages, and we're getting towards the end. As Yaron Ezrahi has noted, Tocqueville's view derived much of its power through the opposition of an honest, visible democratic politics with the dishonest theatrical politics of the monarchy and aristocracy. To this we might add the threat of what became known in Britain as nabobism, the disruptive wealth that the East India trade in particular was bringing to Europe. So we don't really have time to dwell on this, but the trial of Warren Hastings in 1788 in London dramatises this anxiety about the corruption and infection of Indian wealth that is distorting British social structure. And Warren Hastings is then tried, and this very lengthy trial unleashes a whole set of satirical imagery that plays around with questions of projection, proportionality, illusion. So the caricaturist Sayers produces one showing Edmund Burke magnifying all his crimes. Then Gilray does one showing Warren Hastings on the left here, trying to downplay with a camera obscura all his crimes. So the politics, this Eastern politics of the time, is mediated through popular media in terms of magnification, illusion, deception, optical trickery, and Rowlandson also gets in on the act and takes us back to Athanasius Kircher. So there's a lot more one could say about that subgenre of images that I think sustain the general argument I'm trying to make here. For Sayers and Gilray, the two caricaturists whose work we just saw there, mediation is negative. Mechanical artifice produces a dishonest artifice. By the 1920s, the German philosopher and writer Salomo Friedlander was able to imagine cinema as a Fata Morgana machine. In his short story of that name, to which we owe Friedrich Kittler's rather questionable scholarship and sourcing, was able to, so as Salomo Friedlander was able to imagine cinema as a Fata Morgana machine. In his short story of that name, he narrates the dreams of one Professor Abner Sachs Shaw to achieve the optical reproduction of nature, art and fantasy through a stereoscopic projection apparatus that would place its three-dimensional constructs into space without the aid of a projection screen. The professor is successful and contrives a, quote, purely optical phantasmagoria with the aid of stereoscopic double lenses, such that three-dimensional forms were detached from the surface of the projection screen. Friedlander's story then relates the professor's attempt to sell his invention to the military, rejected on the grounds that it might bring an end to war, before providing a memorable description of a European mirage haunting the Orient. Quote, when a storm is brewing, it is unclear whether this storm is only optically real or a real one. Through and through, even the Orient fell into confusion when a recent Fata Morgana, produced by solely technical means, conjuring Berlin and Potsdam for desert nomads, was taken for real. The story concludes by recording the establishment of a doppelganger factory and the prediction that, quote, in the not too distant future, there will be whole cities made of light. Friedlander and Kittler, who cites this story, capture our attention with the audacious suggestion that cinema is merely a mirage by other means, the technological perfection of what is real but not true. But of course we shouldn't be surprised by this, for cinema was merely the culmination of centuries of phantasmagoric effort from the catoptric Sistula onwards. Mirages were also theatrically staged on behalf of science and not just entertainment. The International Exposition at Paris in 1900 was the venue for Eugène Hénard's Palace of Illusions, which, following further technical refinement, will find a home at the Musée Grévin under the name Palace of Mirage. Hénard based his earlier efforts on the Great Mosque of Cordoba, deploying mirrors to produce a sense of infinity, and subsequently incorporated a Hindu temple. The Palace of Illusions, renamed the Palace of Mirages, speaks to the coherence of a linked set of ideas about the Orient in its Muslim and Hindu incarnations and visual disturbance. Okay, next section is called Mirage Medium of Fancy. Richard Francis Burton converted the nabobism that hung as an accusation over Warren Hastings into an enabling technique that allowed European vision to reach into formerly occluded zones. Let's see, Burton. Burton's experience of mirages is intimately entwined with his journey in disguise to Mecca. The two deceptions, Desert Mirage and Burton's own disguise, are triangulated in his narrative with the Kaaba in Mecca. There is a fascinating symmetry between Burton's own presence and that of Mirage. Burton's adoption of disguise and experience of Mirage are all a consequence of his desire to enter Mecca and to see the Kaaba at the centre of Islam's holiest mosque. The Kaaba, the destination, you can see it on the left, in a contemporary Indian chromolithograph. The Kaaba, the destination of all Burton's dissembling and mystery, precipitates an extraordinary description when first sighted. There at last it lay, the bourne, the aim of my long and weary pilgrimage, realising the plans and hopes of many and many a year. The mirage medium of fancy, investing the huge catafalque in its gloomy pall with peculiar charms. The view was strange, unique, and how few have looked upon the celebrated shrine. It was as if the poetical legends of the Arabs spoke truth. Okay, I think penultimate section is called Inside Abdul Hamid II's Head. The history of images cannot, however, be reduced entirely to an opposition between Christianity and Islam. The specific imaginative role of the Ottoman Empire as the sick man of Europe also needs to be factored in. Montesquieu's mid-18th century exercise in what Ros Ballister has termed reverse ethnography, Persian letters, presents a gentle French view of the virtues of European rationalisation and a critique of Ottoman rule which would achieve a new virulence in 20th century preoccupations with the sick man of Europe. The Ottomans are contrasted with the intellectual jewels in evidence in Venice's coffee houses, quote, where the coffee is prepared in such a way, I'm quoting from Montesquieu, that it sharpens the wits of those who drink it, and there is nobody who does not think that he is 4 times cleverer than when he went in. This is an early incarnation of what Jürgen Habermas would later term the critical rationality which characterised an emergent public sphere. Richard Davies' The Sultan and His Subjects, 1907, provides a strong early 20th century view of the sick man. Recalling conversations with his old friend Dick Burton, he remembers his admonition that the, quote, the people of the East need to be seen by their own brilliant light and not by the dim glimmer of a London fog. But nevertheless, Tocqueville's political theory of transparency shines through this caricature of the Ottoman life world, one characterised, according to Davy, by a dreamy existence. The frontispiece to Davies' The Sultan and His Subjects featured a photograph of a youthful and wide-awake Abdul Hamid II, taken by the London photographer W.D. Downey. The dreamy existence of the sick man of Europe was later given a remarkable miragistic form in a series of early 20th century postcards depicting the elderly and by now extremely reclusive Sultan Abdul Hamid II, anamorphistically with a face composed of voluptuous entwined naked females and a fez-enclosed head of empty Oasian nighttime dreams. These popular images, of which there are many more iterations, including Japanese ones, may well have been inspired by a prototype anamorphistic image labelled Fata Morgana. The image here might plausibly be read as a sailor being charmed by Morgan Le Fay. We're back to Arthurian legend, bizarrely. So being charmed by Morgan Le Fay, the sister of King Arthur, who liked to lure seafarers into her submarine palace. Whatever the precise antecedents of the popular Fata Morgana image, it seems clear that the dreamy Sultan Abdul Hamid II comes out of this tradition of representing an individual under the influence of Morgan Le Fay. Fata Morgana is clearly the iconographic prototype for an extraordinary image of political corruption and decay. Okay, I'm going to, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip a bit on Ibn Khaldun and his theory of heat refraction in the Muqaddimah. There is a written version of this available if anyone's interested. And I'm going to move on to the final section. Mirage, Pharmacon, Wild and Domestic. George Hartwig, the 19th century voracious documenter of all things natural and saleable, while noting the thirsty antelope metaphor in Sanskrit, also noted the pharmacon quality of Sherab, Mirage and Bashar al-Afrid. The latter is the sea of the devil. The former, Mirage, is akin to the works of the unbelievers, according to the Quran, which we have seen predicts that, quote, the thirsty traveller mistakes them for water until he approaches them and finds that it is for naught. This points to a paradox in which the mirage acts as a two-sided mirror, as though in an excessively complex catoptric fistula in which two parties on either side see the inversion of what they themselves are. So Burton's obsession with the Kaaba as a black void, a delusional Fata Morgana, is possible perhaps only because he is in disguise. He himself has to pursue trickery and illusion in order to reveal the other's delusional claims in a kind of pathological, oppositional version of Benjamin's mimetic faculty. Benjamin had argued that the human ability to see resemblance was, quote, a rudiment of the powerful compulsion to become and behave like something else. However, mirage experiences can also be usefully approached under other kinds of rubric. Consider domestic and wild mirages, for instance, and the parallel duality of territorialization and deterritorialization. Territorialization involves a taming of the mirage, a turning of the savage dream into something both uncanny and familiar. In Tantan, there is a domestication in which the mirage becomes a subject of comedy as Thompson and Thompson dive into the dry desert in bathing suits worthy of the English seaside postcard artist Donald McGill. We might say that Bob Hope and Bing Crosby established the conditions for a gustatory mirage in the 1942 movie Road to Morocco. Lost in the desert, the pair see a drive-in Mirage, Herbert sandwiches, which they anticipate getting hamburgers and beers from. They run towards it, shouting, it's moving, we've got to grab it." Then acknowledge its instability. You see it, now you don't see it. Before conceding its strong sensory presence. I think it's Bob Hope who says, "Sure was a good one, I could even smell the onions." Conversely, a liberating deterritorializing trajectory might be seen in the Mirage as a prototype for imaginary visions, what the theosophists Annie Besant and Charles W. Leadbeater would call thought forms. These were positive, synesthetic forms that embraced illusion and imagination, not as sources of error, but as portals into a new realm of theosophist perception. Thought forms existed on the border between body and spirit, and were deemed ultimately capable of capture through photography. Besant and Leadbeater point to Röntgen's rays, which had rearranged some of the older ideas of matter, and to Baraduc's experiments in thought photography, evidence they claimed of the permeable boundary of the visible. In Besant and Leadbeater's synthesis of Hindu and Muslim mysticism, we can see early signs of how the East, enduring in the blind spot of European science, would be transformed in one part of the Western imagination from a site of corrupting nabobism or of Ottoman decay, in which illusion was a negative visual poison, into an energizing synesthetic realm in which refraction and the imagination were repurposed as part of new, ostensibly positive neo-romantic projects. This could, of course, also be seen as an echo of a romantic narcotic discourse, which from De Quincey onwards had always shadowed the entire history of Mirage. Nearly there. We should also recognise the ways in which an increasingly connected global world and new media flows and platforms position mirages within different times and spaces. The Traveller's Report, in which exotic mirages were offered several years after the event to the metropolitan cognoscenti, is long gone. That relatively stable world with its slow travel and elongated passage from manuscript into letterpress appears infinitely remote. Mirages now inhabit new slippery horizons and provoke immediate responses. The disintegration of that earlier Miragescape is perhaps presaged by a strange coincidence in northern Pakistan. On May 2nd, 2011, a helicopter-borne assault force left Afghanistan en route for a large house in a compound less than a mile from the Pakistan Military Academy. The town, Abbottabad, had been founded in 1853 following the annexation of Punjab by one Major James Abbott, whom we encountered at the beginning of this narrative, beholding a magnificent Fata Morgana in Malwa. The compound's tenant, who would be shot and killed during the raid, was Osama bin Laden, a connoisseur of dream interpretation. Bin Laden and many of his followers, together with sundry other jihadis, as has been well documented by Ian Edgar, Niall Green and Amira Mittermeier, among others, were as committed to the analysis of dreams as Ibn Khaldun. In the landscape of new fast media, civil society has been remade through the millions that have access to the internet. The Viennese coffee shop has been replaced by the blogosphere and the metronome of apocalyptic time. Some of the consequences of this new tempo of interpretation are indicated by the response to a spectacular Fata Morgana that appeared in October 2015 above Foshan in Guangdong, China. The image took the form of looming dark tower blocks and by all accounts appeared for only a few minutes, during which it was extensively filmed. Internet conspiracy chat immediately connected it to Project Bluebeam, the secret NASA program publicised by the late Quebecois conspiracy theorist Serge Monast in the early 1990s. Monast claimed that Bluebeam aimed to create a new world order overseen by the Antichrist. The Foshan Fata Morgana was taken by some as evidence of stage 2 of Monast's 7-stage prediction, which he termed the big space show in the sky. Monast's increasingly fervid proclamation ends with a perversely Tocquevillian warning. Quote, "If you cannot see, if you cannot learn, if you cannot understand, then you and your family and friends will succumb to the fires of the crematoria that have been built in every state and every major city on earth, built to deal with you." Conspiracies are mobile, and mirages continue to generate new alliances with politics, which continue to attest to the central connection with the question of spectatorial democracy. Monast offers us an apocalyptic echo of Tocqueville's observation that democratic citizens, quote, like to discern the object which engages their attention with extreme clearness. They rid themselves of whatever conceals it from sight in order to view it more closely and in the broad light of day. This disposition of mind soon leads them to condemn forms which they regard as useless or inconvenient veils between them and the truth. Monast and the new attention given to his ideas by the Foshan Fata Morgana suggests that the power of the mirage is undiminished. Waterless seas and cities in the sky continue to act as zones of exploration and critique. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this fascinating journey in time and space. And let's open the floor for questions and comments. All right, while you are collecting your thoughts, let me maybe start with, we've heard a very compressed version of extensive research that you've done on mirages, and we are convinced that, mirage is also a projection. The interpretation of mirage is also a projection, usually externally done. Do you come across in your research also the different visions, the sort of vernacular interpretations of mirages that would be challenging the Tocquevillian model of spectatorial transparency?
Well, the only ones I've managed to locate are the Indian, Chinese and Japanese ones. I've asked many of my anthropological colleagues, and sadly the people they work with failed to originate contrasting indigenous theories of mirage. So what I've discovered is basically in this paper, which is that in an Indian context it's a highly moralistic. It's a vehicle. It's a natural event that is a vehicle. It's a God-given sign in the cosmos that serves as a vehicle for moral instruction. The moral being that one shouldn't search for what is not necessary or doesn't exist. So it ties in with a whole set of other renunciatory narratives. There's a wonderful Jain one about a guy who's a merchant who's wandering through a jungle and is suddenly charged by an elephant, and he sees a big tree above a well, and in order to escape the elephant, he then climbs up the tree, then shinnies out along a branch. The elephant all the time is becoming more and more enraged and is shaking this tree. The guy is precariously hanging onto the edge of a small branch of the tree. He looks down, he sees that the well that he's now suspended above is filled with hundreds of hungry snakes. And he looks up above and sees that there's a white and a black rat, symbolising the ascending and descending modes of the moon, who are busy nibbling at the bits of twine he's hanging on. And he's there contemplating his situation, and then from a little way above, in a bee's nest, a single drop of honey drops down and touches his tongue, and that single drop of honey makes him completely oblivious to his predicament. I mean, that's not a resolution of the predicament, that's just a kind of delusional intermission. So Indian theories and understandings of Mirage are folded in very directly to moral instruction. So the point about the thirsty gazelle, and I mean what's interesting about thirsty gazelle is that it crops up. I think Humboldt is the first person to pick this up, but in all these kind of great encyclopedias, meteorological encyclopedias and other kinds of compendia of general knowledge from about the 1820s onwards, you always have the thirsty gazelle noted as one way of articulating, the Indian way, the Hindu way of articulating what Mirage means. And then there's a kind of very specific scientific, naturalistic explanation in the Ori Penglai, Chinese-Japanese clam monster exhalation. So I found some cultural narratives, and I found an ontological narrative, you could say. I mean, obviously there are more out there, but I haven't found them yet. If anyone knows of any, I'm very eagerly continuing to acquire examples.
Thank you. First of all, one of the fascinating things for me is how the history of mirages intersects the history of many other illusions, if you want to call them illusions. Illusions, visions, miracles, phantasms, and I mean, for many of them, I think it's very hard in a sense to untangle it. Precisely the way that they have been recognized as mirage, as opposed to an illusion or a hallucination or something. And you pointed out a few of these meeting points, right, with technologies, especially. I think so. I mean, I'd be curious to know if you found controversies around them in terms of defining them as one or the other, and what the politics of recognition, let's say, of that in this sense. And the second, which is a related point to that, precisely because I know that there's a history to religious visions, for example, and the way they have been interpreted in many different ways, and they have been subjected to discourses from magic to scientific to being disclosed as hallucinations and all things. But the other point is that I found really interesting is about, you mentioned them as one point as strategies of enchantment. And that made me think of how many cultures have technologies of enchantment. So in the way they produce illusions, the way certain cultures of dream, as you pointed out at some point, have particular practices developed to produce such illusions actively, and I'm wondering how you produce mirages. I mean, there are of course all the tools for that, and how you can use this aspect of it in the research.
Well, thank you. There are a lot of interesting questions there. I mean, just briefly, I didn't have time to develop the argument that Ottoman dreaming theory is kind of exactly the opposite of what Orientalist theory about Ottoman dreaminess is. So it's precisely during sleep that one has access, unencumbered access to direct truth. So it's exactly, it's a state of pure consciousness that is quite the opposite of dreaminess. So there's something very intriguing happening in the kind of meeting of these two, wholly opposed paradigms. Mirages and other illusions. I mean, it would be great if the Catholic Church had an office for the adjudication of mirages, but sadly they don't. I mean, it would be a good source of data. But in the book I did on this, I did discuss various, what would be conventionally described as religious visions. So during the interregnum in England, there were lots of celestial sightings of boats floating above bridges, ships floating above bridges, skyborne ships disgorging hordes of sword-wielding Turks. I mean, all kinds of amazing things.
The city of God that you started with, in a sense, the Jaipur, I think you mentioned, that's a city of God kind of image, Augustinian city of God with a celestial city.
Right,
it's that what freedom.
Well, yeah, there are many more of those, but I mean, I think and there's good reason to suppose that although those have been worked up by the lithographer, that there's optically, they're solidly grounded in optical experience. As you say, there are lots of candidate religious visions, and if you're writing a book on Mirage, then you come across these. Of course, the sort of default setting is you want to think, well, they must have been mirages, if only they'd known. So I think in the first earlier drafts, I got a bit carried away, converting everything to mirages, and then skeptical editor kind of suggested drawing back from some of those interpretations. But my feeling is that if you look at the epidemiology of the term mirage in travel literature, European travel literature from 1800, it goes up to about 1830, 40, 50. It slumps sort of the 70s and 80s. But there's a kind of a nominative determinist breaching of a dam, in that quite clearly people were having all these optical experiences, but were unable to give a name to them. And then what Monge does is say, this thing exists, it has a name, it's respectable, you're not going mad if you see it, if you experience it. And so the high point is the allowing for the lead-in time for publication, 1820s and 30s. There's almost no travel account of West Asia that isn't stuffed full of mirage experiences. So I think the question of the recognizability and the legitimacy of describing the phenomena as mirage is very important to the trace it leaves in the literature. Controversies, there have been many controversies. One I talk about in a lot of detail in the book concerns Reverend Badlam in Alaska, who encountered some backwoodsman who was selling photographs of what he claimed was the Muir Glacier ice city. And Badlam realised that, so he claimed this guy's claim it was a mirage. He sold lots of these photographs. I reproduced some of them in the book. Alaska State Historical Archives has great collections of them. Badlam immediately saw it was an old photograph of the city of Bristol in the UK. And just said this is kind of massive deception perpetrated on visitors to Alaska. But then he subsequently Badlam himself gets embroiled in in Mirage mania and doesn't escape untouched. So, that would be a good example of a controversy where actually there's a lot of fakery, there's a lot of entrepreneurial chutzpah, there's a lot of gullibility, and then along comes a skeptic and blows it all apart.
Thank you for the talk. I was thinking about how closely mirages are connected to representation in general, and how until the first mirage is captured on camera, mirages are basically like they circulate in people's knowledge as representations, because there's no other way to bring this to the people. So it's, for a very long time, mirages are basically representations, and I find it very interesting, and that made me think of how people who because very few people have seen mirages themselves, and how the idea sort of entered vernacular knowledge, and how that sort of became, in most cultures, a thing that would either represent something Oriental or just something miraculous. And I thought of the Hungarian word for mirage, which is the moon puppet. So it has to do with puppetry and the heat.
Mm-hmm.
But it's very unlikely to have a mirage like this in Hungary, but it has its own, cognitive category as well. So I was wondering if it would make sense to track the depiction or perception of mirages through linguistic means, to analyze how the word itself appears in different languages and track that kind of representation. And that also made me think how language itself is kind of a representation, like how we can connect language as a representation of thought, and then mirage being a representation of an actual thing.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'd love to hear more about the Hungarian description for this, and then I can see how that might prove very fruitful in that case. It's not clear to me how far one could go in other contexts with the linguistic route, but I mean, I think that's in principle, very insightful. I mean, I think as to the question of, so mirages were this kind of anomalous class of representation, and then the question is, has science kind of contained them, neutralized them, has it explained them? And I mean, I think as with most things scientific, there are different audiences for different kinds of science. So, Serge Monas, the raving fascist conspiracy theorist that I cited at the end, science is not going to neutralize his view of what mirages are ever. I mean, he's on a different plane. A much larger number of people probably had mirages routinized by the invention of tarmac in 1901. So this sounds a bit silly, but a massive part of the story is that when metalled roads started being built, they produced massive regular heat gradients. And so that heat haze you see on the road, which is a mirage, and it's due to the fact that the road building material attracts and radiates heat. So you get this dramatic heat gradient that produces these optical effects. And in Nature and Scientific American, circa 1900, 1901, there are lots of excited reports about this. The mirage has become every day. So it became sort of routinized. So that was a kind of important moment. So it's it's strange that it's kind of almost every 100 years, Monge, 1800, tarmac, 1900. But these are the kind of epochal moments in mirage history. So I think that one of the things that happened with tarmac roads is that everyone knew what a mirage was, and almost everyone came to experience one. Whereas before, they're surprisingly rare. I mean, I've come across several accounts in many of them in Scientific American, where mariners would describe Mirage in the Sea of Constantinople. And they'd say, I've been sailing for 40 years, this is the first one I've ever seen. Kind of quite puzzling. So that all gets ratcheted up with industrial modernity and road building. So you could say there's a kind of disenchantment there. But it also I'm not sure I can make a connection here, but it's putting me in mind of that great Walter Benjamin quote where he says, look not at what the neon sign says, but at its fiery reflection in the asphalt below, in that puddle in the tarmac, where it's pulsing and magical. And so maybe I shouldn't be exaggerating the kind of disenchanting potential of metal droves. The other thing I suppose is that mirages haven't been fully conquered by science. I know a few scientists who say this is romantic nonsense and this is a problem with anthropology. But there are lots of anomalies that remain to be explained. So the whole question of the cultural template that's placed on Mirage, the kind of raw material of Mirages, remains completely mysterious. The sort of apperceptive process through which you culturally mediate the raw materials of Mirage's optical effect. So, for instance, there's a very famous Arizona, he was originally Arizona-based meteorologist, James Gordon. He then went and did some work in New Hampshire. And he met people he claimed to remember from 30 years ago. So he's there in the 60s, meets many people who remember seeing regular mirages, elaborate superior mirages 30 years previously that were Islamic cities. And he hypothesizes that this might be a city in North Africa, which, because of freak atmospheric conditions and long distance looming, so that's the ability of images to project over the curvature of the Earth. So this is just a hypothesis, and he's kind of saying, I know it sounds a bit crazy, but there isn't a better explanation. So generally, people tend to see, as you see in the Japanese examples, all the clam exhalations are all Japanese and Chinese building styles. There's no Islamic minarets there. So you tend to see the local architecture for a range of possible reasons. That's the architecture you're familiar with, you project it onto this crude template. Or, especially if there's looming involved, then it may be projecting an actual part of a townscape. So anyway, Gordon's mysterious Massachusetts transatlantic North African city, that's like the holy grail for mirageologists now, is to crack that one and to try and understand how could that happen. Could have just been collective delusion. It could be benign Orientalist fantasy. But it could be other things as well, and the fact that it's possible to say it could be those other things suggests that science has not fully killed mirageology.
We're running somewhat short on time, but we have still time for one more question. There are hands in the audience. If not, then please allow me the last question. Following up on what you said, it seems like there is almost a reverse relationship between mirages in travel literature and photography. So you've mentioned that there is a kind of rapid decrease of references in travel literature around the mid-19th century. If I got you right, exactly when kind of photography takes off and a lot of the travel books are being illustrated. with photographic images. Of course, in the beginning, it's a clumsy technology which there is a long exposure time, and it's understandable why it's not hot on camera. Yet you've given us primarily illustrations that are not photographics of the mirages. So I wonder why we are not experiencing a kind of hunting for mirages with the camera. Is there a kind of sub field of photographic images produced, as there was an attempt to grasp the spiritual dimension, the spirits in the early photographs? Why is there not a similar hunt for mirages with the camera? Is there some kind of contradiction there, or you see any other reasons for that?
Well, the three most enthusiastic camera hunters I can think of all hunt in the name of science. So there's the two Kyoto physics teachers, there's a Norwegian guy, and someone working out of San Francisco, who produce huge numbers of Mirage images. But
Would that be already 20th century or still?
they're currently
later?
practicing. Yeah.
Currently, yeah.
Yeah.
So the photographic images you've shown us were also very recent, right?
I showed one from 1886, which claims to be the first photograph of a Mirage from South India. I mean, I think one of the things that's going on is that part of the seductive magic of the Mirage does depend on the ability to work up the image through particular media. So lithography was particularly well suited to enhancing what otherwise might not be fully visible. When you look at steel engravings, for instance, it's often very difficult to even make the Mirage visible. And so you have to have these, rukn figure, these halted traveller figures in the foreground pointing, because otherwise you look at the image and you think, well, you can't see it. So you need someone to inwardly direct your vision. Lithography, I think, was particularly good at emphasizing the subtle optical effects of Mirage, so it could bring out and exaggerate those qualities. Some of the Kyoto images are quite jaw-dropping and stunning. They're time sequences, so you see what happens to a bridge over a period of an hour, for instance. You see how it can turn into a crenellated city. But yes, those are secularizing, disenchanting projects. Whether, of course, they then provide the basis for a new re-enchantment, I don't as yet know. But I think the question of medium and media is a big part of the story. So in the book version of this, I talk a lot more about sfumato, that Leonardo's legendary smokiness, where substance and air meet, that in-between space with mysterious hybridity. That's, I think, key to successful Mirage depiction.
Thank you very much, and I'm very happy that we'll continue discussing the complex relationship of images and our conceptual frames as we project on them tomorrow at 9 o'clock with our class. And until then, have a great evening, and thank you again.